Okay, so for this next section or two, actually, I'm going to do two sections of this video. I'm really just kind of going to speak to it and walk you through it. I'm going to show you how to actually do these calculations and these analyses in the context of the practice problems, where I'll walk you through the actual problems that are set up to reinforce these concepts. But we're continuing to look at the relationship between risk and return. And this section 8.6 here, really, it's all just getting to this idea of these two investment rules. Number one is, if two investments have the same return and different level of risk, the investment with the lower risk is preferred. And conversely, if two investments have the same risk and different expected returns, then the investment with the higher return is preferred. So that makes sense, right? Only is life ever actually like that when you're comparing two things, right? So, if you have investments, opportunities that have, expected returns that are different and expected risks that are different. I mean, here we have, this is the small cap stock, right? And this has the highest return expected and the highest risk, as opposed to the, I believe L stands for long-term government bonds. So you can't really objectively say that one investment is better than the other, because they both have different risk and return profiles. And so how can you bring the overall risk of your investments and the overall return of your investments into the best possible place? And the answer for that is to diversify. And that's what the next section talks about. So when you have the opportunity to invest in more than one asset, right? And so this goes beyond just, stocks and bonds. Of course, this is real estate and land, investing in a business of your own. But, if we're just strictly talking about a financial portfolio of securities, stocks and bonds, then if you diversify your investments into a variety of categories that fits your personal risk profile and desired return levels, then you can increase your overall rate of return relative to the level of risk. And by the way, your risk profile, your risk tolerance, is going to change at different points in your life. When you're young and you have a lot of time to wait, you can go ahead and invest in securities that have a higher overall average return, but more probability of having a negative return. Whereas as you get older, closer to retirement, the likelihood of you needing to cash out of your investments at any particular time is fairly high. And so, you can't really afford much risk. Most people don't feel that they can anyways. So a lot of times when you're working with a financial advisor, they will put you in a portfolio relative to the number of years until retirement, right? So that's what diversification is about. Now, how mathematically that works, they take you through an example here in the book, but instead of walking you through a bunch of numbers and trying to explain what these numbers are saying, what I'm going to do, like I said, is leave the mathematics side of this until I take you through the practice problems for the homework. The thing is that diversification operates to reduce risk because of the fact that sometimes you can have investments that move in opposite ways. So if you have an investment that is going to give you a large positive return in the case of a boom economy and a large negative return in the case of a bust, And then you have an investment that is going to give you, the opposite sort of pattern, right? Then you can reduce the risk by basically having some stocks that do well in recessions and some stocks that do well in boom situations. And we can mathematically use this idea of correlation coefficient to describe numerically how two asset returns move together over time. So if you think of two stocks, two companies that respond the same to economic conditions, let's say a high-end retailer, a Nordstrom's and a Neiman Marcus, they're probably going to be pretty correlated in terms of what happens with their stocks, strictly speaking in terms of how they respond to economic conditions, right? But if you take a Neiman Marcus and a Dollar General or a Walmart, right, they're probably going to not be as closely correlated in terms of how they react to economic conditions. So that's what correlation is about. It's about the idea of how an asset's return moves together with other assets' return. Okay, and so again, this section of the chapter goes through a detailed numeric description of it. So here we have, perfect positive correlation of two assets. We have Pete and Repeat Company, right? It has basically just the same thing, right? So the portfolio is going to be equally risky because you basically are buying two perfectly positively correlated assets. But, all right, here's Zig and Zag, perfectly negatively correlated. When Zig is going down, Zag is going up. When Zig is going up, Zag is going down, right? And so when you superimpose those two on each other, you wind up with the return that is just steady with no standard deviation. Now, for most stocks, they do move together. Most stocks are going to do better in good times and worse in bad times. But they're never going to be perfectly positively correlated, and rarely going to be perfectly negatively correlated. So if you, basically, the idea is that if you get stocks that are as diverse as possible in terms of their response to economic conditions, then you can go ahead and kind of reduce the standard deviation of your portfolio down, fairly low. And so the chapter goes on to talk about what's called systematic and unsystematic risks. So systematic risk is like something you can't avoid, right? So if interest rates rise, those are going to affect all companies in the economy, right? That's sort of systematic risk. We don't know what's going to happen with interest rates. We don't know what's going to happen with, the economy in general. And so to a certain degree, you can't diversify away the risk that comes just from systematic risk that is just sort of out there in the economy. However, unsystematic risk, you can diversify away. You can just sort of buy a diversified basket of assets, and the diversification in and of itself will eliminate a lot of the unsystematic risk. Here's a little graphic that shows the overall risk of the portfolio, and as you diversify, so on the x-axis is the number of stocks in the portfolio, and as you add more different stocks to your portfolio, you reduce the unsystematic risk, and there's studies that show that probably a bundle of 30 stocks is probably enough to eliminate the unsystematic risk, but there is always going to be some systematic risk in the economy. And so we're going to leave this one for here. Again, I just kind of talked through the concepts. They are not going to make a lot of sense until you see them in action with an actual example. But I just kind of wanted to get this vocabulary out there talk about the relationship between risk and return, talk about correlation and how having a bundle of minimally correlated diversified stocks can reduce your unsystematic risk. And again, we're going to, I'll show you how to do these calculations when I'm showing you how to do the practice problems. Okay, you practice along with me, they'll make a little more sense. Okay, so I'll leave this one here, and then we'll move on to measuring systematic risks.